On November 8th, 2022, Honda announced the reintroduction of the Transalp. Right now we only have basic specifications for the machine, but that's enough information to begin to compare the Transalp to other middleweight and middleweight plus adventure bikes to see how it stacks up. Today we're going to take a quick look at several key specs shared across the segment, such as displacement, power to weight, suspension, and more. Yikes, that's a lot of data. I'm going to throw this slide back up on towards the end of the video in case you want to pause, but for right now, let's get into the power plants of these bikes. So these two charts are going to focus specifically on the power plant, weight, and that correlation. And as you can see here, the Transalp is the third smallest displacement engine at 755 cc's, with the new V-Strom, BMW's 850, the DesertX, and KTM's 890 all having more. But when we flip over to horsepower, things get a little bit more interesting, with the Transalp tied right in the middle of the pack with BMW at 90 horsepower. Again, the Ducati, KTM, and Honda's own Africa Twin making more. The Transalp is producing the same amount of horsepower as the BMW, but it's taking the BMW nearly 100 more cc's to get there, and they're using a higher compression ratio. And speaking of a compression ratio, almost every other bike on this list has a higher compression ratio, save for the Africa Twin. I've also included a power to weight bar, kind of in that magenta color. In this case, I did multiply that number by 1,000 to get something on screen that would be somewhat meaningful. And I think we're all very interested in understanding exactly how the Transalp is going to deliver 90 horsepower from 755cc displacement on a brand new Honda engine. Now, I don't think anybody would argue with the idea that it's going to be beneficial for Honda and us as consumers for them to develop a competitor to the Tenere 700, but instead, what they've made was a bike that more closely competes with their own Africa Twin, and let's take a look at why that's the case. The Tenere 700's displacement is 689 cc's, the Transalp is 755. So just under 10% more displacement for the Transalp, but a whopping 25% increase in performance over the Tenere. That's pretty impressive. Honda's new power plant's also showing a 14% increase in horsepower generated per cc of displacement over the Tenere, and a massive 28% increase of horsepower per cc over the Africa Twin. And I would suggest that one of the reasons that Honda has such high reliability is that they're not pushing their engines to absolute max performance, that they're using lower compression ratios. They're over-engineering and overbuilding everything for that reliability. Things get even more interesting when you directly compare the Transalp right with the Africa Twin. If we're to believe the power and weight claims from Honda, then what are really the key differentiators that would prevent the Transalp from cannibalizing the Africa Twin's sales numbers? Let's move on to suspension for just a moment. Here in this slide, you can see I've got two different charts. The lower chart is simply describing seat height. The upper chart includes ground clearance and front and rear travel. Here you can see the Transalp is the second from the lowest seat height, making it fairly approachable. But in addition to the lower seat height, you're also dealing with less than optimal ground clearance and suspension travel. And this suspension's preload only, or preload adjust only. It's difficult to understand why they're making so many different trade-offs. The Transalp has the worst suspension in this group. You've got low travel on a non-fully adjustable platform with poor ground clearance. Now, we could all argue that for the vast majority of riders, that's plenty, and I wouldn't disagree with that. However, if people are going to begin to evaluate the bike based upon these specifications, then we can't ignore this information. Of course, that may all change when the bike is actually released, and at this point, it's not even announced for North America. We don't know a lot of information about the platform or the bike yet, so I'm simply taking the available specifications and kind of distilling them down, trying to understand where this value proposition is for Honda. For sure, for consumers, having more choice is great, but when they're turning out a bike that is going to be competitive in the middleweight adventure category, and I've thrown some middleweight plus bikes in here as well. And I would consider a middleweight plus bike being like the DesertX, the Africa Twin, the V-Strom may be in there as well, but you've got bikes that are right around 500 pounds, and the weight of the Transalp is not significantly less at 560. So if I'm going to pay that 40-pound penalty to move up from the Transalp to the Africa Twin, I'm getting a substantially more capable platform, more electronics. I'm getting more horsepower and more torque, which you could argue could be a detriment on trail. But again, you're only paying for that in a 40-pound incremental weight gain. So it's not 160 pounds. It's not 180 pounds. It's a very incremental 40 pounds. And if we're going to talk about value proposition, of course, we have to talk numbers. These are listed in US dollars. We've got some different prices in here, so this is the best I can do with the information that we've got right now. So we've got some 2023 pricing and some 2022 pricing. We don't have anything on the V-Strom. We don't have anything on the Transalp. You can see the Tenere 700s, a couple $100 more for 2023. The Ducati is as well. I would assume that you could add a couple of $100 to the Tuareg and the 890 Adventure and the Africa Twin to be competitive. But what does that mean for the Transalp? If you're going to compete with your own product in the Africa Twin, and the Africa Twin offers a much more compelling power plant, a much more compelling electronic suite, much more compelling suspension. But for that, you're going to pay 40 pounds, if you will, in weight. So how much less does the Transalp have to be than the Africa Twin's 14,500 to make it a more compelling solution? And if it is then meant to be priced with a Tenere 700, is it going to be around that $11,000 price point US? And is that enough of a differentiation between the Africa Twin to make the Transalp something that most users, or at least some users, would select? And if you're in that $11,000 price point, why aren't you looking at the Tenere 700? The Tenere 700 also offers a much better value proposition in terms of the suspension. You're dealing with more ground clearance, slightly more travel on the front, but it's fully adjustable. And as far as the power plant for the Tenere 700, it's reportedly making less than the Transalp, 72 horsepower for the Tenere 700 and 90 for the Transalp. But let's just say I have my doubts that the Transalp is actually going to produce 90 horsepower. But hey, I really want this to be a two-way conversation. I'm simply grabbing information that's readily available and putting it into a format that was easier for me to look at and evaluate, and hopefully it gives you guys some food for thought as well. But by all means, please, in the comments, tell me how many ways I've got this wrong so I can come back in and make some adjustments to these graphs. I do want to thank you guys for spending a couple of minutes to look at this information so we can at least begin to unpack and understand where the Transalp may come in from a model lineup perspective. I'm very excited about the bike. Who doesn't like new motorcycles to be on the market? Love it. I think the V-Strom is going to offer a compelling solution as well, and ideally, competition benefits us as consumers and riders. If you haven't already, please consider hitting the subscribe button, especially if you like this kind of content.